event of the post-Olympic season. We decided not to compete with beach volleyball. One of the pleasures for those of us working here in July was the resounding noise coming across, and also the occasional rehearsals of medal ceremonies. And what did Jeremy Hunt, what did he get in the dummy medal ceremony? Was it a bronze or a silver? But anyway, when they rehearsed it. So this is our first event of the autumn season. We've got a lot more coming up, which I'll mention right at the end. And we start with a bang. We did decide the timing of this one on reshuffle. So we had an elegant decision. And we, in fact, one of our, someone involved with the Institute has now become a minister. I had long discussions with Nick Bowles, who's now stepped down from being a fellow here, obviously, since he became planning minister last week, to which we wish him all best wishes on his opportunities as the most unpopular member of the government, very, very quickly. And Nick always thought it would be last week, so we took Nick at his word, and he had a rather more nervous week last week than we did, and so we'd arranged this event this week. Now, we've got a galaxy of talent, which I'll introduce in a second. What we wanted to explore was the how and why of Prime Ministers reshuffling their cabinets, and also what the impact was. Not just in the light of what happened last week, but we'll obviously discuss that, but also going back further. So for that effect, on my right is Hilary Armstrong, who went through various reshuffles as Chief Whip under Tony Blair. Andrew Turnbull, to my immediate right, who saw it from various perspectives, both as the Principal Private Secretary in number 10, then Cabinet Secretary, and with one or two pretty controversial ones. To my immediate left, and I'm very solemn if I ever said that, to Montgomerie, who runs one of the most important political discussion forums in the country in Conservative Home, which he built up, and it was central to the reshuffle last week, and before the reshuffle, to be crucial. And since then, of the debate about what's happening, we'll come to that. And on my extreme left, my very good friend and former colleague, Treneman, who is the sketchwriter of the Times, who I worked with for many, many years. I heard the jokes before they appeared in the paper. And they were good then too, who has experienced many reshuffles. And I finally realised I should move on from journalism when Anne knew the identity of obscure backbenchers and what they were interested about, and I didn't know it, and I realised then time to move on. And I said to her when I left, danger of becoming a nerd about it, but she's a nerd with wit. Start off. Why reshuffles, Hilary?
I'm going to be very tedious and give you a constitutional answer. We are a democracy that does not have a separation of powers. In countries like America, you know, the formation of a cabinet is a very different event because the executive is not part of the legislature. So the main thing in the UK is to remember that the executive is part of the legislature, and for many people who get into the legislature, who are MPs, this is about their profile, but it's also primarily about their career. And they therefore want to be mainly in government. There are not many backbenchers who start, or MPs who start off as backbenchers who do not have their eye eventually on being a member of the government. There are one or two notable exceptions, and I could tell you who they were on our side, on the Labour side, but mainly they do. And it also means that the person in charge has got a whole group of people that they have a bit of responsibility to. And therefore, reshuffles are, yes, partly about party management and about making sure that you get the, because we're largely a two-party country, and, you know, I'm not going into the coalition, but because of that, you mainly get a sort of broad church within the government party or the main opposition party, and you have to sort of keep that broad church together too. So reshuffles in this country are largely a product of our electoral and parliamentary system. And they are about, I mean, you know, I can tell you what used to happen was the Prime Minister would come with his list of jobs that he thought were most important, and his list of who he thought was doing okay, and we would then disabuse him, you know, talk to him about it, contradict him, tell him how we saw it, and we would move on from there. And then, of course, he also had to listen to the big beasts. So the other people in his senior jobs in cabinet would all talk to him privately, individually, about who they wanted in their team, about who from their you know, chorus of supporters they wanted to be in a position. And he would also have to bring that to the table, and we would then start to try to work it out. And reshuffles, and you know, for him, it was largely about how do I get a government ministerial team that I can let them get on with it because they understand what the priorities are, they understand how to make things happen, and they'll get on and do it.
We'll come to what actually happens on the day in a minute. Andrew, how much were they planned? I mean, you worked for various Prime Ministers under your various hats. How much were they actually planned events?
Well, can I just answer a more general question of you about why they come about? There's a contrast between the managerial world of the civil service, or as I now work in industry, where reshuffles take place all the time. People retired or are retired, promoted, move sideways to enlarge experience. And also people are deliberately not moved because people think they need longer in this post. And it's all related, it's all underpinned by performance management, career development, interviews, succession planning, etc. Now, Hilary's made clear the ministerial reshuffles are divorced largely from all that. And they are sort of freestanding events dominated, one by the hunger for preferment, which we've got to try and satisfy, and two, this concept of refreshment. And I think it's nearly always disappointed. And this idea that there's no real concept of how long you need to stay in the job to do the job well for the organisation. Now, Anthony King is doing some research, and he's asked various people, how long does the minister need to be in the job in order to be effective? The answer I gave, which apparently was about the longest of anyone, was 3 years. And in particular, you've got to get to know the constituency, and if in a world where business is done internationally, going to ECOFIN, it helps if you are one of the more senior people. So this, but it's all driven, it's not driven by the needs of the organisation, the government, because they want to find that combination of people who will most effectively deliver their policies. Here is made absolutely clear, it is driven from below by the pressures of the people who want preferment, and if they don't get it, or get it and then get put back into the system, as ex-backbenchers, will be a source of difficulty. That is what drives the system, and that's ultimately why it produces a very inefficient outcome.
Tim, how important do you as a commentator, you as part of the debate, regard reshuffles? Do you, I mean, from everything inside you, from Hilary and Andrew, how did you view reshuffles?
Well, I think we're, as commentators, fascinated by them and spend probably far too much time talking about them and obsessing about them. And beforehand, I think an awful lot more ink is spent speculating about what will happen in the reshuffle than is spent reporting it. And it's sort of not dissimilar in some respects to party conference speeches. Party conference speeches are always billed as hugely important for the leader and are forgotten about 24, 48 hours after they're given. Now, having said all that and trying to sort of put them into perspective, they matter. They matter hugely for party management and a sense of a balance of the parliamentary party's morale and moving the talents. But most of all, although they are about personnel, I always I'm most interested in reshuffles that are about changing policy. And I certainly think the last reshuffle was most notable for its continuity of the big beasts, and therefore am I straying into territory?
No, we'll come to that later on. We'll come to that later on. And I'll come back to you in a minute because we're going to come to next to how smoothly they happened, the day. a list is drawn up, you're saying, after the consultations, when you disabused Tony Blair of who he thinks is good, you told him what's good, he's talked to Gordon Brown, and he's talked to various other of the big beasts in the cabinet about it. How smoothly does it work on the day?
Never works smoothly. Because some people are not around, or they can't, you know, or they're on their phone so much that Switch can't get them. Some people you think you're going to offer the really best job ever, they're the ones who are invited to walk down Downing Street, and then they refuse the job. Don't want to go there, and that's particularly difficult if they're near the end and all the other slots have gone. Then cabinet ministers, when it comes to junior ranks, they'll sometimes get somebody they really don't want. Or there's somebody that one of the big beasts wants slotting in and none of the cabinet ministers want them. So, you know, it's never smooth, but on the other hand, sensible people, we used to advise how to deal with it. Keith Hill was always brilliant at that.
As PPS?
Yeah, but also when he was in the whip's office. He used to tell any whip who was going, you don't whinge, you say, you're very grateful, will be an enormous privilege, and then get on and do what you want, what the Prime Minister wants you to do very effectively. And that's where I sort of disagree with Andrew. Ministers are not meant to be super civil servants. Ministers are not meant to be the operational directors. They are meant to be leaders, they're meant to set the policy framework, and they're meant to make sure that there are priorities that the department carries out. They're not meant to be
Hilary,
super civil servants.
4 Home Secretaries in 5 years and 4 Defence Secretaries in 5 years is deeply, deeply dysfunctional.
Yeah, but then, you know, there are other things that are deeply, deeply dysfunctional. We never used to know. You would have a civil servant working on an important piece of work, and they would disappear, and you never even knew they were going. You know, so I mean, it happens both ways round. But I mean, I was in my jobs too long for you, because I was in one job for 4 years and another job for 5 years. So, you know.
Andrew,
The best example of something going dramatically wrong was that the process started at 9 o'clock. Geoffrey Howe comes in and he's told he's no longer Foreign Secretary and he's offered Leader of the House. Very grumpily, he comes to the House over here, and at 3 o'clock he still hasn't come back. And there is a deadline. Basically, you've all got to complete this thing by 6 o'clock. So by the 6 o'clock news, you have got the main cabinet.
Yeah.
That was very, very difficult indeed. Some days you can get through the thing quite quickly, but there's lots of little details, and ultimately like who gets chevening and that kind of stuff. Takes a disproportionate amount of time, or silly things about titles. Occasionally the Prime Minister makes a mistake. He offers someone the Secretary of State, Gavin Strang, tells him he's going to be Secretary of State for Transport when he isn't. He's going to be the Minister for Transport working to John Prescott, and then you have to quietly unwind this and tell him that he hasn't quite got the job he thought he got. So they get lots of mistakes do get made, but really, very often it's that very key job right at the top of the process that you've got to get right. And if you don't get that right, all the rest is put in peril.
and also, how much input would you have into what the Prime Minister did? Because I mean, you and your fellow permanent secretaries put in assessments of people.
Well, occasionally we do what Hilary does, and he says, you know, this person is great, and say, well, quite frankly, it's not what I'm hearing. You know, this person has no rapport, no effective relationship with his civil servants, so the department's in a shambles. But ultimately, I would say the whip has more influence than the private secretary or the cabinet secretary on this.
At the end of the day, do people who were lined up get left out? I mean, is it totally symmetrical? You know, 85 places, 85 people, or are there people who either stay who were intended to be sacked, or were intended to be included and, sorry, they didn't get the job?
Yeah, that inevitably happens. I mean, that's why in some cabinets you end up with far more people attending cabinet than are members. And it's ridiculous, you know. I mean, they need a bigger cabinet room at the moment. And and it's also true that some people who you really don't want to lose, but who are good folk, but actually, you know, they get moved, and then you end up with nowhere to put them. And, you know, I mean, Tony famously made reference to a few like that in a conference speech. And they behave themselves perfectly afterwards. And, you know, but on the other hand, that's sometimes a problem because actually they are the ones that get left. If they really, you know you're not going to get a problem for them, the imperative to find them something isn't quite there. And there were quite a few people who got in that, you know, we didn't think should get in, but just because somebody wanted them in, and they ended up, you know, counting paper clips.
There's a number of consolation prizes. High Commissioner in Malawi.
But Tony never believed in that, and we never did any honours either. So, you know, that was a real problem for us. We had nothing else to give
people
them.
are invoice, and they increase the number of unpaid jobs. These are all ways of kind of letting people down gently.
Now let's come to the drama of the day. Now, Anne, what's it like? You know, you're normally dispatched to Downing Street. I remember you saying, "Oh dear, the call's come. I've got to go there. It's a lovely day like today, being wet there." How was it as an event at the Reshuffle, Anne?
Well, I think the word event is possibly overstating it dramatically. Get to Downing Street, we stand there, then you basically listen to Nick Robinson or Adam Bolton tell you what they think may or may not be happening for a long time. And occasionally the press secretary scuttles out of the number 11 door, so he won't be in shot, and comes over and whispers something, but they already know that anyway. And so the actual reshuffle is taking in someplace in a cloud up above, and then the cars come in, and I just think I'm sort of fascinated by the different cars that come in. So I was really surprised that Justine Greening came in a Jag this time. I thought that this is not good, you know. Why is it, you know, she's transport secretary, she should be walking for starters, you know. And a Jag, that just is not the right message there. So they have, and then basically they all come in, they're all shouted at, because there's a guy at the BBC who that's his role in life is to shout, "Are you about to be sacked?" or something really exciting like that. No one ever says anything, hardly. They go in the door, which opens by itself somehow. I don't know how that works. And then you kind of wait for them to come out. And in general, this particular reshuffle, there at one point, everyone had come out. The only one we didn't recognize was the Welsh secretary, was the man. And I couldn't figure out who he was. And I know everyone from behind, even. And I kept saying, "Who is that guy? I think he was a fake. I think he wasn't even a..." Anyway, it turned out to be David Jones.
On his website, it does say he's well known in North Wales.
Yes, I bet he is, and only there. But so I think I think what happens a lot is that I just feel the drama needs a complete refreshment. And I think any party planner should be able to do it like so much better. And I also think that, I mean, it was very obvious that something very bad had happened to Justine Greening. She looked like she was about to kill someone when she came out. And they had to back up her Jag special so that her door aligned perfectly with number 10 door. So all she did was have one door opened, again, no hands, and then she just literally jumped into the back seat. So you could see her face, which looked like fury. So I think, you know, you should actually get over that. It's so much better if you come and talk to the camera, if you can, you know. It's so much better. And this time only Hunt did it.
And pressure on his part.
That's because he was stunned.
One of the ways the whole thing's changed, and instead I should mention, anyone who wants to tweet, our hashtag is reshuffle, singular, is the existence of websites like yours and tweeting. I mean, as someone said, this is a Twitter reshuffle. I don't think Downing Street produced a press release on it at least a couple of days later, but they were announcing things on Twitter, which is the first time I've done. How did the fact it was partly an internet reshuffle, both in the debate beforehand, where you ran lots of pieces, really from July onwards, and during the dog days of August and the run-up, and then on the day, you were running commentary. How does that alter it?
Well, the Twitter certainly was interesting just, you know, over the immediate reshuffle period. And I think we learned that Cheryl Gillen definitely wouldn't be Secretary of State for Wales anymore because she updated her bio on her Twitter page to say that she was just the MP for Amersham, and that was spotted. So we knew that she was already on her way out, and Saeed Avasi did something very similar. So people were bypassing people like Anne to communicate their status very directly, and I think
that's such
tipping people off.
Isn't that bizarre?
Yes. But it's definitely a new ingredient. We had, you asked me earlier how important these things were. In terms of our traffic, we had 8 times as much traffic as a normal day on the reshuffle. And I know I spoke to David Willett, hope I'm not breaking confidence, but he said he spent most of his day just visiting Conservative Home, finding out what was going on, just putting up the rolling list. And
Or not, turned out in this case.
but I think what the websites do generally is, you know, we can, in a way that a newspaper like the Times doesn't have the space to cover every angle, you know, we can obsess about every portfolio. We have the time and the inclination to do it. And so we ran a campaign for, quite a steady campaign on the Secretary of State for Wales, saying this was something the Conservative Party hadn't had a Conservative MP as Secretary of State for Wales since from Wales since about 1987, and the rumour was that Maria Miller was going to go there, and we fought sort of quite relentlessly for that. And so I think you can help create a mood for certain things.
Yeah. Now, let's move on. Successful reshuffle. I mean, you get it over with. You put the press release out. And you think, oh, thank God that's over. How do you judge a successful reshuffle? The ones you were involved in, Hilary, working for Tony Blair. What were the successful ones, and in both in party management terms as your priorities chief whip, and perhaps reviving redirection of government?
I don't think you would say any was totally successful or totally unsuccessful. There were some really good moves, and there were other moves that that just didn't work out. The boss was always happy when he really felt he had someone who knew what they wanted to do in a department and were going to drive it. I was happy when I had, and this is my perspective, I was always happy when I had a Secretary of State who knew what they were doing but also had a political hold and would run good team meetings and would involve their team and their whip in what was going on, and who then, we could get a good dialogue going on where policy was going and where the difficulties were going to be, etc. For me, the really good Secretaries of State were the ones who handled both the political end as well as the policy end. And you'd be amazed at the numbers. You had to work really hard to get to do that, because they saw their advancement probably being much more around policy, and it was somebody else's job to get on with the relationships and the rest of it.
Andrew, what
An example
was?
of a successful requirement is often there is a machinery of government change at the same time, because this is the Prime Minister's best chance to take a portfolio from X and give it to Y, because he's changing the people at the same time. An area where it worked extremely well was prior to the election of 2005, in Whitehall, incredibly acrimonious debate. It was agreed that benefits, payment of benefits and job search, a system of job search should be brought together. The people in the Department of Employment says, yes, bring it all together with us, and the people at DSSS said, bring it all together with us. And there was fighting between Michael Bishard and Rachel Lomax, literally blood on the floor. The Prime Minister then said to Alistair Darling, I am giving you this new department of work and pensions. And he took that away, made a great success of it. In my view, it's been a successful department, has a good rationale, and it ended that argument in 10 minutes.
Whereas Lord Chancellor was not ended in 5 minutes, and he's still running around now. And, you know, that was really because nobody had the history.
I was going to ask you on that, because you were Cabinet Secretary then,
Yeah.
and that was complicated by Derry Open, wasn't it? The whole reshuffle of 03, the change, the creation of the Supreme Court, Judicial Appointments Commission, and then the Lord Chancellor, where, as Hilary says, there's still lively correspondence about where the Lord Chancellor should be and so on.
Well, that was not a successfully handled reshuffle, though I will defend the substance of the change very, very strongly indeed. I don't think anyone will ever reverse that, for example. You have to prepare adequately. What happened immediately before that reshuffle was it coincided with the publication of the 5 tests. And the Prime Minister wanted to show the glass was half full, you know, are we nearly there? Yes, we're getting there. And Gordon Brown wanted to say, actually, we're still miles from this. And they went round to try and, they spent the time, 2 days, trying to persuade people that a sensible decision had been reached. Prime Minister then went to Paris for a bilateral with Chirac. And then he came back and he started work on this reshuffle. And he had not spent the time, and you were probably the Chief Whip at that, he had not spent the time with the Chief Whip preparing for this that he should have done. And we got also, not just, particularly it was the Lord Chancellor bit that was most difficult, but also it was one of those things where it was that moment, I was talking to Andrew Kahn, is that I know thee not old man moment where the Prime Minister finally realised he had politically outgrown his mentor and had to move on. Incredibly painful. So it wasn't prepared because he just didn't want to talk about it. So you do need to prepare for it carefully and prepare the messaging. Another messaging we got wrong was it got out that the post of the Secretary of State for Scotland was being abolished. You can't abolish it because it's in statute. What we were doing was something different, which was asking one person to be the Secretary of State for Transport and Scotland. So we messed up that message. And that was all really because the preparation hadn't been thorough enough and there were too many distractions.
Well, I mean, Tim, looking at the impact of a reshuffle, you mentioned earlier policy. Can you, I mean, not just the recent one, we'll come to the recent one in a minute, but past reshuffles which you felt that's actually made a difference, as opposed to satisfying people's ambitions and so on. I mean, you know, both Hilary and Andrew have illustrated some of the pitfalls and the problems of proper preparation. But those cases where actually you felt, I mean, the classic one that occurs to me is bringing back Peter Mandelson. I mean, after a difficult Labour conference, it was a complete coup. None of us, I mean, I remember and I discussing it at the time. Wow, he's back. And that seemed to change the dynamic, certainly disabled the Tories for a bit.
Yes, well, Peter Mandelson's return, the Conservative Party had been obsessed with Lord Mandelson for a long time, and I think his return certainly distracted us. You know, I think reshuffle should largely, you know, be judged on those 2 criteria: party management, which Hilary is very familiar with, but also policy. And I think in the most recent reshuffle, you know, it is remarkable for its policy continuity more than anything. I think the exceptions are almost certainly transport, where there's been a huge spotlight. Why was Justine Greening, who'd only been there for 10 months, why was she moved if there wasn't some sort of intention to move on the Heathrow 3rd runway? We talk about a ministerial merry-go-round. Well, the Transport Department, I think, has been about the most switched around as any. I think you would probably say the other 2 departments which we can look for policy change in the months to come would be Justice, where Chris Grayling is hugely caricatures in my view. You know, he is of the right, but actually he's been there with IGS working on rehabilitation to a huge extent, and I think that will be his flagship initiative. The coalition will mean that he may want to send a lot more people to prison, he may want to move on the Human Rights Act, but that won't be possible. And also I think the other one to watch is Owen Paterson at DEFRA, where some very important decisions are going to be taken on shale gas. And suddenly you have a minister there who is very sympathetic to shale gas, which many Conservatives, rightly or wrongly, see as a game changer in the energy sector. And now there is someone that George Osborne will have as an ally, moving the Conservative Party in a more radical direction.
New personalities. You, on the reshuffles you covered, you said, wow, I've got new cast of characters to write about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Peter Mandelson was a deep joy. That I still miss him on certain days. I think, oh, if only he was presenting some paper in the Lords or something.
And he misses you too, I believe.
I'm not sure if he misses me that much. But, I also think that I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know whether you're going to move on to women. But, I mean, having just sat through Maria Miller's debut at Culture Questions, I think that I don't know if perhaps a great deal of thought is given to, are they actually going to be good? Which is slightly cruel, because I think it's very also, it's the weirdest job in the world, isn't it? All of a sudden, you become an expert in 10 seconds, and you have to get up in what must be terrifying at the dispatch box, and people make fun of you, and you have to be good. But nonetheless, that is the job description. I mean, and I think it's quite difficult. So some of the new people, I always feel slightly bad as I'm being horrible, but not that bad, because it's their job.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's made this reshuffle a little bit harder for people like Maria Miller is, you began by talking about the Olympics. I think, don't know whether Hilary would agree with this, but the ideal time is probably to have it before the summer so that people can spend their summer months when Parliament's not meeting reading into their briefs. This time, the idea of switching people who prepared for a long time in the transport, the home affairs, the culture portfolios for 2 years or more for the Olympics, David Cameron had to wait until now. But it's meant that suddenly the party conference season, this 2-week meeting of Parliament is upon people, and then that makes it, I think this has been much harder for ministers. And can I just talk about women?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And the Conservative Party clearly had a problem in the sense of it wants, David Cameron is absolutely wanting to promote more women. And at the moment, just at that sort of competing for cabinet level positions, he doesn't have a huge pool to choose from. And I think that's a real problem for him, and he wishes it was otherwise. And it's made harder by the fact that the Liberal Democrats only contribute men to their 5 slots. But the future, I think, for the Conservative Party on this level is very good. And I was someone who resisted the A-list that David Cameron tried to impose on the party. But I think there was 2 forces. One was the grassroots, absolutely determined to answer Anne's question, are they any good positively? You had the centre trying to get every woman possible in, and we've actually got one of the best ever crops, I think, of the 2010 intake. Many, many women of incredible high standards, but it's going to be a little while before they are at that level. And there were people like Theresa May and Theresa Villiers, who I think in the shadow cabinet were put up too early, too quickly. And I don't think that mistake will be made again, and people are going to give them more time to be prepared for that.
But you had exactly the same thing as Chief Whip, because there was a big influx of women starting in 92. The real one was 97 with Labour women, when way before it happened on the Tory side. Was there a conscious policy with appointing women ministers and promoting them?
Oh, there certainly was. And in our party, the Prime Minister would have been in deep trouble if he'd not taken that very seriously. And he was also surrounded by folk like me and Sally Morgan and so on, who wouldn't have let him get out of the door, and certainly wouldn't have let him back in the door if he'd not done that very seriously. And I understand where Tim is coming from, and if I was in his position, I'd probably be saying exactly the same. But the truth is, the current government does not have a good record with women, and isn't actually very good at giving them the right sort of support and the right sort of briefing to make sure they do get the confidence and they do get the response in the media and so on. And this has got to be a much more rounded cultural thing about how you see diversity in the people who you are seeking to deliver the priorities, to be the face of government, that they've got to reflect the diversity of the electorate. And, it's one of the things that we just have to make work. And, not all the men are brilliant, and some of them who've been there a long time are not brilliant. but they get away with it because it's seen as the norm. And what we should be doing, all of us, is switching what people see as the norm and get them to look at what is the possible. And that's not been happening.
Can I raise one other thing which is much
I'm sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
No. Andrew, you want to come in?
It's still on gender.
Yeah.
No, I've got one other different point, but I'll finish gender and then come back.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted, there was a lot of discussion last week, notably on Tim's site and also a lot of other comments on junior ministers. And particularly because you mentioned the coalition, we hadn't mentioned the coalition almost previously, apart from the Lib Dems gender issue, was that there was a lot of sense of, well, Matt Hancock and Michael Fallon being put in biz to rein in Vince Cable. I remember talking to a civil servant in last week. He said, come on, junior ministers don't matter, it's the Secretary of State that matters. Isn't there a great danger of exaggerating a junior minister in practice compared to the Secretary of State? Tim?
Well, I don't think so. And I think Secretary of States are very different creatures as well. And John Hayes, one minister who was until the reshuffle in 2 departments.
Yeah.
He was in Vince Cable's business department and he was in Michael Gove's education department. And he said, it was fascinating to watch the very different styles, of the 2 men and how they ran their departments. And ministers would essentially turn up to a meeting with Vince Cable and it would very much sort of be chairman of the board. He would ask what ministers were doing, they would talk about what they were doing, he would comment and he would input and then they would go away, almost as self-functioning ministers. Michael Gove, in contrast, and which John Hayes sat at his meeting, would come full of ideas, full of an agenda, probably the kind of minister that Tony Blair would, she wanted, come with a clear agenda, absolutely what they wanted, and then would ask for comments, and would incorporate them. It's not a minister who doesn't listen, but it was a very different style. And so I think ministers, particularly in certain departments, will matter more depending on the attitudes of the Secretary of State. And rightly or wrongly, a lot of, whenever I speak to junior ministers, they find the civil service incredibly frustrating. And they are beginning to, Grant Shapps and Chris Grayling formed a sort of intermediate, a group where junior ministers were regularly meeting and learning the lessons of how they actually get things done in their departments, what would work for them best in getting over barriers. And others, of course, not always civil service resistance is sometimes very necessary and informed, and what you could learn from it. But it's an unglamorous job, but the junior ministers are the water cannons. They are the people that get things done, whereas often it's the Secretary of State who are much more strategic in the public face. So junior ministers matter hugely, I think.
Andrew?
A fact I wanted to bring in, rather overlooked, which is the freedom, what freedom does the Prime Minister have to shape the cabinet that they really want? The most dramatic example, I suppose, is 1981. Mrs. Thatcher had inherited the sort of posh old men and then reshaped her cabinet very significantly away with Soames and Carlisle and later Pym. And brought in people like Norman Tebbit, who, against many people's expectations, proved to be quite a successful minister. When Tony Blair came in, he was still bound by this rule that he had to find places for the shadow cabinet. So he had David Clark, Michael Meacher and Gavin Strang.
He didn't have Meacher in the cabinet.
No, the whole point is, but he had to kind of, they weren't actually in the cabinet, but he had to find kind of posts for them, and then subsequently was able to move them off, rather than going straight to the formation that he wanted. But he was always constrained by the fact that he had to have this sort of Brownite, Blairite balance. John Major never had the political power the size of the majority to do what he wanted. Now I think you're right, as Ed Miliband changed this rule, that if he came back, he would be able to choose from the start the people he wanted.
Well, I'm not sure that it's gone quite as far as that. What it is that in the shadow cabinet, before, when you were in opposition, we used to elect the shadow cabinet, and he's changed that. So you don't have to elect the shadow cabinet, and therefore he appoints them, and that means that,
I mean, that's the same effect.
It's the same in the end, yeah. I would just say, though, it's a bad reshuffle departments without a single woman in the ministerial team. And that was what I was meaning, Tim, when I say that, you know, he hasn't thought about how he's going to bring through his next tier because they ain't there.
Right, before opening it up, just one question I want to ask each of you to comment on. Can the process be improved? I mean, you all described, both of you have described the inevitable last minuteness held up by a big beast wanting to go off and think things. I mean, in 2001 it was Robin Cook when he was moved out of the Foreign Office and so on, exactly the same as the one you're describing, Andrew, with Geoffrey Howe in 1989. Can the process be improved, Hilary?
With difficulty. I mean, the problem is now that Twitter and all of these means you can't have a sensible discussion. And that's the big problem. That you know, I used to go in with this with my sort of social work history, saying, well, if we talk to people before they see the Prime Minister, then we can prepare them for where, you know, what might be happening. That was disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. I can tell you some really, you know, horrendous tales around that. I think the key thing is, as Andrew says, it's not like a company. It's not like anything else. These people are there because they've been elected, and that is a huge difference to any other organisation. I think if you could have lockdown on Twitter, on the press, and so on for a week, and then do it at the end of the week, yes, it would be a lot better process. But that is, you know, I mean, that is never going to happen.
I don't think even Brian
I don't
Lawson's
think
going
you
to say
can
that. Andrew?
Now,
Well, what would a company do? It would talk with the sort of most senior people would say, long before you're actually going to make any moves, you talk about succession planning. Who's been in the job how long? Who needs to move? Who needs to stay to develop? What kind of things this person needs to do next? And to get much better intelligence, or allow the chief whip to offer better intelligence of who is actually doing well and what you're going to do to develop the next tier. And if you're looking at the point you're making is, if you haven't got women in Minister of State level, you're not going to get them at the cabinet level. That should have been thought about at a much earlier point in the process. Now it makes it more kind of managerial, less political, but in the end it will produce better results.
Right, Tim? How do you improve the process? I mean, or do you feel, well, you had some influence on it, so it's a good process.
Well, the one thing I thought David Cameron got right at the beginning of his time in as Prime Minister was that you shouldn't have too many reshuffling of people, in the sense of leaving people in position to master their own briefs. And I think that basic view was correct. But I think what we have learned is that waiting as long as he did for his first reshuffle has meant, and the way he at least conducted it, has meant that it's been more disruptive than I think is sensible. And so, you know, you have whole departments, transport, health, justice, spring to mind immediately, where there is almost no ministerial continuity. And so one thing that I think is essential view, that you leave people in place for a long time, is correct. But saving all the moves up for one go seems to me to be an experiment that probably shouldn't be repeated.
But there's another aspect of it which has struck me, it's actually surprised me, is the number of ex-ministers who are now stirring. I mean, I can't put on the Today programme in the morning and hearing Gerald House this morning saying cut defence spending, boost defence spending, Trump predictably on HS2 and so on. There's a whole range of them who are stirring. I mean, it's great for you, Anne, isn't it?
It is great for me. I mean, I think as a sketchwriter, I don't really want the process to be improved, particularly. But I always, I mean, just this time, you know, Baroness Varsi, you know, who apparently was so irritated she actually went up north and was conducting everything on the phone. And, you know, he just kept giving her more stuff. I think it's bizarre. I mean, I think it's totally bizarre. I actually think it's bizarre that he can't decide he wants to move, I don't know, his defense secretary or his foreign secretary. I mean, I can see why he didn't, but the way it seems to work is it makes, at the moment, it made this Prime Minister look much weaker. It made the coalition look like it didn't exist, because Nick Clegg had David Laws over. That was it. And I just don't. It didn't work as a coalition. It certainly didn't work as team building. And I think in the end, it really made the Prime Minister look weaker than. I mean, can he really be that weak? I have no idea. Maybe he is.
You mentioned, Andrew, very interestingly, how, and Hilary did too, how people were made envoys, there were SOPs given. I mean, you didn't use the honour system, there was a minor use of it last week. Did you feel sometimes, wow, I know I've made an enemy with that change?
Oh, there were certainly things where we knew that basically they were going to go out and they were going to cause trouble. And you just had to accept that. There were others that we thought there wouldn't be trouble. And there were others that you tried to offer a good way of them not leaving looking as if they'd been sacked or looking as if, but they very rarely took that route. I mean, I have to say, Tony used to find all of that bewildering, because he just thought people would have had felt they'd been, really lucky to be in government, and all of this. And he didn't believe in the honours system. So we did have a policy that we weren't going to give honours to politicians, to certainly to parliamentarians, when he was Prime Minister. And he just couldn't understand why people thought that was important.
Because he'd never been anything other than Prime Minister, possibly.
Maybe.
Andrew?
Well, you always have to take a certain amount of care with the people you are demoting or sacking. And I think one way that often, the night before, you would see someone that was going, you wouldn't require them to come into number 10. Or the case of Mrs. Thatcher sacking Edwina Currie, I had to show her out the back, which was fortunate because coming at the front was the British Turkey Federation delivering a turkey for Christmas. But I also got home once. This is when Norman Lamont went, and my son said, "I've recorded the news for you." And as each of these defeated walked down the street, he was playing the Queen number, Boom 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 Boom, and another one, Bites the Dust. And I said, "This is outrageous that BBC has treated it so frivolously." And then I realised he just sort of lashed this thing up. But you've got to handle people with care. And it's not always done, and it doesn't help if, say, the press secretary or then you get briefing. Well, he was pretty useless anyway. You've got to be prepared to be charitable to people when they go, because they all have dignity and they have families, and they also have colleagues and friends. So
and they have constituents.
And that side of it could be improved.
Yeah.
Right, let's open it up. There are a lot of people here who also, we have a wonderful alternative panel in the audience. We have a former cabinet minister, Ben. Ben Bradshaw.
Ben Bradshaw, the subject of a number of reshuffles. I think Tim's been a bit charitable about Cameron and his women problem, actually. I mean, he did have two female cabinet ministers who weren't demonstrably worse than the men who he got rid of, and another one he shunted from transport to DFID. So the problem is partly of his own making. I think there are ways you can improve it, and one of them is that ministers get absolutely no performance management at all. You're appointed a minister, you sink or swim, there's no training, there's no support, nobody tells you if you're doing a good or a bad job, and then you're either promoted or sacked, and nobody tells you usually why you've been promoted or why you've been sacked. And I think most reasonable people, most politicians, I agree with Hilary, they consider it a huge privilege to be a minister, even just for a year. But if they're sacked, they're quite like to be told why. And I know a number of colleagues who I think would have made good ministers, but who couldn't hack it because they were given no training and no support, and they were then sacked. So I think that is one way that you could improve the thing. The other thing really is the 2 points that Hilary pointed out, which is that what I think breeds real frustration, even poison in the party, is where people see big beasts protecting incompetent ministers and making sure that they either survive or get promoted or get into government. And I don't know if you think there is something that could be done about that. And the other one is the perception, right or wrong, that it's ministers who create a fuss and throw a tantrum that actually get the jobs, rather than the quiet, competent, loyal ones who just do the day-to-day work.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. You echo a lot of the work actually we've been doing here. Well, I was going to mention earlier, we produced a report last year on how to be an effective minister, which actually echoes the question on how long should people be, and our view was 2.5, 3 years, obviously varying between cabinet and depending on the post. But our view was at your end of the spectrum, but also that point on, which came across a lot in the interviews we did, on the total absence of performance management. And we interviewed a lot of ex-ministers, actually a lot of permanent secretaries, and the startling thing is compared with anything else, and one of my colleagues is doing it, her experience is mainly in the private sector, just couldn't believe that ministers were told nothing. And whereas every single person working for them was part of a complicated performance management system and so on. But Hilary, you want to come in there?
I was exceptionally keen on this, and I did a pilot survey of backbenchers about what they felt their skills were, what they were bringing, and so on. And I couldn't put that out to everybody because somebody leaked it to some member of the press, and it then became a little bit of a story. And because it was only 2 or 3, I could sort of, diffuse it. But it was, so you think people are hopeless, and they don't, they need training because they're not good enough, sort of stuff. I just think that, I wanted to see Parliament as, it was the phrase of the moment, a learning institution, where we all, I think everybody should be in that position, where you see yourself learning all the time, whatever profession you're in, whatever you're doing. But because irresponsible members of the press think that that is nonsense, we just hardly dared do it. I mean, I also tried to get a whole thing about the Parliamentary Health Service doing stuff on addictions and how you handle addiction. But again, that was stopped because it was, you were saying you've got a load of drunks and all the rest of it. So I absolutely, and Tony did this for a while. Every cabinet minister got a letter which set out what their job was, what the priorities would be, and what the Prime Minister's priorities would be, their letter of appointment. That was very important. And we then tried to link training to that, so that every junior minister and every new minister went to, the one that's been abolished now. But again, some cabinet ministers didn't see that as important and didn't send their juniors.
Isn't a key part
But absolutely, he's right. Training is very important.
Training is part of an apprenticeship system, and the master in this is the Secretary of State.
Well, that was what I was meaning.
Who has got to mentor those 4 or 5 junior ministers. Some of them are good at it, and some of them
Well, that was what I
all.
was meaning when I said I like the Secretary of State who understood their political role, which was training and bringing their junior ministers.
But they were the exceptions,
and they were, but there were some good ones. There were others who weren't so good.
Now, I can take 2 or 3 questions now. Tim. Can you say who you are?
It's Tim Bale, Queen Mary, University of London. On process, every time there's a reshuffle, I always think, surely someone could invent a piece of software that would allow this to be done rather more easily than on a whiteboard, which was what David Cameron, I think, was using. But the more serious point is, Tim has referred and Peter has referred to the media having an influence on who goes where, who's up, who's down. And I wanted to ask Hilary whether that is in fact the case, whether in the months leading up to a reshuffle you do pay attention to what commentators are telling you to do.
Yeah, we'll take a couple of questions. Lady there.
Sarah Buckley from the Institute of Chartered Accountants. I just wondered what you thought about prior experience in ministers. It's quite a common experience to look up the biography of someone who's just been appointed to a portfolio that's of interest to you and perhaps realise that they've got a great professional background in it, or perhaps realise that, say, they've been appointed to a senior business role and actually they spent most of their life as a librarian. And there are weaknesses to having professional experiences and strengths. So how much do you think that's considered when people are appointing ministers? I'm not expecting the answer to be much. And how important do you think it really is?
Right, we'll take gentleman there.
Yes, you have. It's just a couple of points. The reshuffle seems to be a very British institution. It doesn't seem to happen in the US or continental Europe. In the Soviet Union, Mr. Gromyko was foreign minister to the USSR for 28 years, which I couldn't imagine happening in this country. Peter and myself are probably old enough to remember the biggest ever reshuffle, which hasn't been mentioned, which was Macmillan's in 1962, which was badly mishandled. And the effects persisted until the election of 1964. Barbara Castle just a quickie, they said that when ministers were appointed, you could never absolutely predict who was going to do badly and who was going to do well. There were plenty of ministers who have brilliant futures predicted, who failed at the jobs, and other ministers people thought were going to be losers, who in fact grew in the job and did very well.
Yeah, I was only a precocious schoolboy in the nice and long night. Being a well-educated schoolboy. But the three different questions. One is media influence. Two is a very interesting one of does the professional background make a difference to choice? And the last one, the two, you asked two. One was the uniqueness to Britain, which is certainly true of the type of reshuffle, and also being very unpredictable who does well, who does badly. Andrew?
Well, on the predictability, I absolutely agree with you. Anthony Eden absolutely understudied the job as a complete flop. Norman Tebbit, I would say, was a surprise. And you think that some people are just going to make it. So you've got to take that risk. Junior ministers, it's sometimes said that we have more junior ministers than any other country in the world. Most of continental Europe makes use of non-elected but politically appointed junior ministers, the state secretaries. So one of the reasons we have these big reshuffles is because we've got a lot of people to reshuffle, plus the fact that because it's a closed system, anyone who moves out is replaced by someone else who's in the pool. You don't go out finding someone who's working for a bank or a company somewhere and bring them in. So you get these big repercussive effects. So I think that's why our reshuffles look a lot bigger than other people's. On the question of prior experience, I would say, no, I don't think you want prior experience. I would definitely not want, although we had this, a farmer to be the Minister of Agriculture. But what it tells me is more about leadership qualities. But that then points to this question of, if they're not going to come in as experts, you've got to allow them time to become, to some degree, experts.
Hilary, media influence.
Media influence has, of course it has an effect. I mean, Charles Clarke. Charles went out because of the campaign, I think it was the Sun was having. And Charles was very angry about that because he felt he could ride it. And I was part of that decision, really felt that, the government would be too damaged if we left him there in that particular job any longer. And he left the government. And actually, he shouldn't have left the government. He was, offered other jobs, but he was so angry that we were listening to the media and not just looking at the job he was doing. And he was I think he was a good Secretary of State, but, that is a very good example of where the media had over-influence, and I think this lot get away with murder and don't get the same sort of hounding, but never mind. I hope it'll change in the next 2 years. Expertise and experience, yes, they are looked at. But again, I accept what Andrew says. You don't put somebody who's got a sort of vested interest and a very partial view. You're really looking for someone who understands what running, what this is all about. And it is about leadership. And it's not about having knowledge of the intimate detail of whatever. It is having a grasp of where you want to take that and how you're going to lead people to get there, both from the civil service and from the rest of your ministerial team, but also from Parliament generally. And that, for me, is still why we're so very different, because of the nature of our parliamentary democracy. Our parliamentary democracy is very different. Jack Straw tells a fabulous story. And, he actually rang me that night. It was chucking it down. It was after the Iraq War. He was in Blackburn. It was during the election campaign. The rain was hammering down. It was quite early on because they were big mobiles, and he was out on the doorstep. You know, Jack does a lot of and had to do a lot of campaigning, and the driver calls him back and says, "Minister, there's a phone call for you." And it was the foreign minister of Russia. And the foreign minister, you know, they exchange greetings, and the foreign minister says, "What are you doing?" And Jack tries to explain to him. And there he is, foreign secretary with responsibility for all of these things and all hell going loose in one part of the world. And Jack is out campaigning on the streets, trying to save his seat, and having to do these phone calls from the back of the car, etc., etc. That is the difference. It's a huge strength of our democracy, but it also has its quirks, and one of them is the lunacy of reshuffles.
I partly want to respond to what Hilary has just sort of said about the idea that Conservative ministers aren't hounded in the same way that Labour ministers aren't.
They're not.
I think if you look at, if
Not
you ask
yet.
George Osborne or Ken Clarke or Jeremy Hunt about their experience in recent months, I think they will disagree with you. And I think, you know, I think each of those examples, in a way, proves or raises questions about, you know, when the media does have influence and when it doesn't. You could easily say that Chris Grayling's replacement of Ken Clarke was a result of sustained pressure from most of the tabloids against Ken Clarke over a long period. And one of the under-discussed things at the moment is the Sun has been very different towards the Conservative Party in the last week, and compared to a year or so of extraordinary criticisms. I think something has changed there. Look at Jeremy Hunt. There's hardly any sort of pundit newspaper that didn't call for his head at various times over the last few months. And where I disagree with Anne and some of the other things that's been said, you know, there was David Cameron. You could call it bloody-mindedness, you could call it stubbornness, but he, you know, in pointing Jeremy Hunt to health, he was showing, you know, he picks his cabinet, not the media. And I think actually, you know, I'm sometimes known as a critic of David Cameron, but I think one thing you can't really accuse him of weakness in this reshuffle. He moved almost everyone where he wanted them to be. The only exception, which has sort of been a little bit of controversy, is Ian Duncan Smith. But I think generally that was a conversation between two grown-ups, particularly to an ex-leader, and Ian was invited. Did he want justice, or did he want to stay at work and pensions? It was an open offer, and Ian chose to stay at work and pensions.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, to me, I always, when I left Downing Street at the end of, and virtually every reshuffle, I think, how has that been derailed quite so amazingly? You know, how did that happen? You know, how did he end up with 3 extremely unhappy women in the last hour of his reshuffle? We all knew there was only 3 jobs left. We all knew that someone was furious. And I just think one of Dave's particular problems is that he, well, I think Tony Blair would recognize this, he can't move his chancellor. The economy is the huge issue, and you can't, it's completely not for discussion. And so that whole, then, you know, Theresa May has been a surprise success, and besides that, she is a woman, so she's got to be there. And then there seems to be all these other people who can't go. William Hague, who won't do any other job, you know, it's all sort of stacking up. So he ends up doing what I call like the Swan Reshuffle, where the top of it looks exactly the same, and then all these other people furiously battling, you know, underneath. And I think that creates a certain unhappiness with people, you know, within MPs, because they think, oh, you know, I'm never going to get there. You know.
Can I just make one comment on the thing that you can't predict? Mainly because most MPs have had no preparation for having a department. Some are good, some bad. Some just don't adapt at all. Some are very successful. Well, we've got time for just one other round of questions. I want to gentleman there.
David Neater from Elect. Just wanted to pick up on the point, the media point. And I mean, call me naive, but when I hear a comment like, you know, Hilary, you're talking about cabinet reform, and you're saying that because irresponsible members of the press thought it was a nonsense, we hardly dare do it. And then you're confirming that by saying the media, and I think we're all, you know, saying to some extent the media has an influence on government action. Question is, you know, what does it say about so-called democracy? Is it really a democracy, or is it a mediocracy, which really will lead to mediocrity? What is your view?
I always say you ask very simple questions. Andrew Kahn.
Thank you, Peter. Can I ask a sort of off-the-wall question? When I look at almost all other organizations, there isn't, I can't think of any type of organization which would choose to change a large swathe of the senior echelon at the same time. I mean, no hospital or school or company would do that. No international organization would do it. Why would it be possible? Is it completely mad to think that actually you don't need reshuffles, but you change ministers when change is required? I mean, somebody dies, somebody has a scandal, somebody resigns, somebody's proved incompetent, that you shift them along. You need to promote a few people, so you make a few changes. Why is it impossible to have a system where you would have, as it were, a continuous reshuffle? You would change when you needed to make some change. I mean, logically, I can't see why one shouldn't do it. I can see politically it's not comfortable, but could we move to such a system?
Right. Alex Allen, who experienced it as a Crystal Bright secretary in Downing Street for a long period.
I just want to pick up something that came up right at the beginning, in some ways, when Hilary and Andrew were talking about the, you know, the way that things start going wrong almost from the beginning. And you know, I wonder to what extent it's practicable, really, to have the, you know, the thing planned out meticulously in advance, or, and you know, how much people think that is desirable. I mean, you know, that in my experience, that nearly always needs to be a, you know, a plan A, a plan B, and then probably C, D, and E as well. Because, you know, I mean, in this case, in this reshuffle, it seems that, you know, Ian Duncan Smith was offered the choice of justice or not, which meant that there had to be a, you know, a plan B, depending on whether he did or didn't take it. And then these cascade all the way down. I mean, you know, all the way, it forks and forks and all the way down. And, you know, there have been many other examples where, I mean, I remember one when I was number 10 when Norman Lamont was moved from the Chancellorship. John Major felt he had to offer him Secretary of State for the Environment, not sure whether he'd accept or not. You know, he didn't, but that, you know, and then that inevitably creates a whole cascade of different options, which means that, you know, the further down the tree you get, the more uncertain it is at the beginning.
And Graham Allen at the back.
Thank you, Peter.
I should point out Graham Allen's select committee is doing an inquiry into reshuffles.
I'm glad you did that, Peter, because I would have to do that. I'm speaking personally because our inquiry is just getting underway. We've invited the Prime Minister and we're awaiting a reply. I think I'd like to start really on a personal basis by congratulating the Prime Minister for keeping people in place for nearly 2.5 years. That's led to civil servants who know the boss who knows the department. It leads to select committees able to develop a proper relationship with ministers, and if a select committee chair, but also as a backbencher, for me to get to know ministers as a backbencher on issues of concern for me, and to get them to follow through on big issues like early intervention, for example, that I'm very involved with. The same team of people. When we were in power, on my side was in power, it seemed there was a reshuffle, if not every couple of months, it felt like it. And there was a sense of insecurity, impermanence, inconsistency. And I think people didn't quite know what they had to do to keep their job very often. I think what Cameron has done on this occasion has taken the people who were very ideologically driven, and I believe in political primacy, so that's fine. The people who'd done the, Ian Duncan Smith's a classic example, who'd thought through their policy field and talked to people And they came in with a very clear view of what they wanted to do in their respective departments. Having had a reshuffle now, you have promoted a group of people who weren't that driven 2 years ago. People who are looking, in a sense, for the next job, not just this one. And I think that's probably not good for governance. What it will mean is the civil service will have to take, whether they want it or not, more of a role on policy. It will mean that ministers will skim and be superficial because they're anxious about the next reshuffle. And I hope very much that the Prime Minister decides that this is the only reshuffle of his term. And let's not forget now that it is going to be a fixed 5-year term. If we want to bring consistency, long-termism and effective policy making to the UK and to government, having a fixed 5-year term might well be matched with having terms where ministers know that they can be in power for a little bit longer than under the last government. So it really is a case of, as the gentleman at the front said, there's no other business that runs itself professionally that would operate on this basis. And replacing people because they're not competent or because of deaths or scandals should give you enough play as a Prime Minister to gently move the machine in a way that you feel is effective. And the last point is, what about Parliament? This is all really, a lot of this is media driven, party management driven. Can't Parliament, at the very least, ratify the key Secretary of State appointments? Not that they would be able to vote them down, but have a role of some description in the process where at least they get to hear what the views of the appointee is at a very early stage. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Craig. Briefly, because we're just about to run out of time, I know. Tim?
Well, I agree with a lot of what you said, Graham, about continuity. I think, just quickly thought of Michael Fallon, Red Tape and Business, Liz Truss, Charles Clare, Anna Soubry Health, Chris Grayling, Prisoner Rehab, Nick Bowles, Planning. Actually, the Prime Minister's put a lot of people in certain positions. You may not agree with the positions they hold on those things, but actually they have thought about a lot of these things, and it's not always possible at the beginning of a parliament to put people in place in the round pegs and the round holes straight away. I won't answer every question, but I thoroughly disagree with you about the need for Parliament to ratify a Prime Minister's appointments. The Prime Minister's got to have the freedom to choose his own team, otherwise the uncertainty of and instability in government, I think, would be enormous.
Mediocrity. I might ask you to get into the full elegance of the question, but.
I think sometimes it's hilarious that after we would sit around in the Times room and after the reshuffle actually managed to creak its way through to whatever was happening. And we would say, we got that one right, we got that one wrong. And there's an awful lot of that. I mean, you can have campaigns. Like, of course, I didn't even know you were having this campaign about Welsh Tories. I mean, amazing. I mean, no wonder the Prime Minister listened. But so I actually think that is completely overplayed. I mean, I think Charles Clarke, I always had this vision of him sitting in the garden crying on the bench when he was refusing the jobs. But I mean, he could have stayed in. He chose not to because he was so furious. So I think, I just think it has some effect, but I think it's a little overblown myself.
Yeah, to both of you, two very interesting questions. I mean, one, as Alexander said, you can't pre-plan. You've got to plan A, B, C, D. And the mischievous question from Andrew Kahn, why can't it be like an ordinary company?
Well, there are two, like an ordinary company, there are two major differences. When someone leaves a company, they leave the company. What happens here is they leave the government and go onto the back benches. And where they, if you handle them badly, you are going to get a lot of trouble. I can remember being in the room with Tony Blair, being urged by Hilary and Sally Morgan, can't you find one more promotion? He said, every promotion, it means another person out there who is then causing trouble for us. And that is a major, major constraint. The other feature, of course, is if you try to say, well, as someone, they're not really doing the job. If you say, well, you're the only person that's moving, to really highlight that person and their inadequacies, and it is much easier to say, I'm having a reshuffle, and you're not the only person that's going, I've got to do a whole series of other things. And it makes this handling of the politics of it and the personalities of it so much easier to do it collectively, rather than when Norman Lamont was different in a way. He was picked out, slightly odd, it was May or something, it was a very odd time to have a reshuffle. It's always very difficult if you just pick on somebody. So you say, I've decided I'm fed up with Andrew Lansley and he's run his time, he's done too long. To do that in isolation would have been quite destabilising for him personally and for the party as a whole.
Hilary?
You have to understand, I always have a go at the press, you know, and it's that sort of relationship, and I probably shouldn't have used the word irresponsible about them. Would they ever be irresponsible? And I don't think it is a mediocrity, but we live in a world now, I mean, you know, when I first got to know Parliament, before I became a member, because my dad was a member, you know, none of this ever got out. And, you know, it didn't get out until it was all finished. And the sort of, life was very different. And I left the Commons because I didn't want to get into Twitter and Facebook and all of that. You know, I'm just too northern and old-fashioned for all of that. And you know, and so, and I recognise that about me, so you have to understand that's about me. But I mean, essentially, you cannot run politics like a normal business, because it has a relationship with the public that nobody else ever has. And individually, the individuals have relationships with the public that push them in all sorts of different ways. And I used to ask my whips to keep in contact with the group they were looking after, just so as they knew what was motivating them and what was moving them and what had happened at the weekend and what was happening with the family, because that changed the way they behaved as politicians. And when you're talking about government, you're not talking about perfect models of governance. You know, I now do loads in the voluntary sector, and you know, the lessons I've learned I now use there, but it's much easier to sort your management board out than it ever was doing government, because you don't have that same electoral relationship. Now, as I say, democracy is not pretty, it's not easy, it's not comfortable, and if you have an executive that comes out of that, then it's not going to be pretty easy and comfortable. But it can have highs and successes that very often you would never see in another organisation, but it can also have disasters. And, you know, for me, it's just an exciting roller coaster, which just has some dreadful things in the middle of it. But you've got to keep your clear priorities and your clear vision and know where you want to go, and just try and take as many people with you as you can. And that's what you expect of a minister. And I also disagree that, you know, I mean, I know that's been your experience then, but I can tell you, we worked really hard to try to talk to people who were going out, and very often they were not prepared to talk about it and didn't want to hear. And I also tried to institute systems where you got a bit of training and so on. But you're all individuals in Parliament, and nobody has the right to tell you what to do. And that has consequences for cabinets and for reshuffles.
Hilary, thank you very much indeed. Indeed, thank you all very much indeed. It's been full of insight. I've noticed one or two other veterans of reshuffles who remained silent.
Yeah.
I know in some cases, of course, it was perfect in their time, and calm. But I thank very much Anne Treneman for her views, for Tim Montgomerie, for Andrew Turnbull, and for Hilary Armstrong. It's been absolutely fascinating. Very glad, good start to the autumn season. We've got Oliver Letterman here on Monday talking about the role of the civil service. I know that's going to be absolutely fascinating. And that's part of a series of events. If you look at our website, it will tell you much more about what we're doing. We've got a very interesting session on Europe. We've got museums Finance Minister coming, and we're doing things at each of the three main party conferences. So we've got a lot underway. Thank you very much, and if you join me in thanking the panel.